Good afternoon. It's Sunday, September 15th. Is that right? 2024, 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. You're watching Co-op for Two. Today we're going to read through the final fourth letter in the Celtic Curse, a Dear Holmes series that we've been playing over the last month. This letter will be the solution from Holmes. We're going to talk about the case, what we thought of it. We'll rank it amongst the other Dear Holmes cases we've played. And I thought maybe at the end we'd talk a little bit about some of these other case file books because I've gotten two new ones that were recently released. We'll talk about the genre, look at some old and new when we're done. But let me just push these out of the way. Let me see how everyone is doing today. We've got our normal group here. If you haven't watched the first three letters played through, then you shouldn't watch this video. It won't make any sense. What else should we talk about? On Friday, we played a Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective fan-made case. I know I say this every time we do, but they're always a pleasure to play. And we should play them more regularly. I have done a couple of videos. One is called The Best Kept Secret in Mystery Gaming, and that's these free fan-made Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective cases. The one we played on Friday was called The Locked-In Lawyer. It was quite well written, quite enjoyable. And a little bit of lessons to learn for writing cases. I'm always on the lookout for little lessons or tricks. And I think we learned a couple from that case. One having to do with side cases and one having to do with a narrative device of setting the scene. In that case, it was a snowstorm covering London. And we sort of saw it discussed in every little paragraph we read, every scene. And it was quite effective in setting a mood. In the coming weeks, the schedule here on this channel is going to start ramping up a bit. That's because we're heading into October, where we tend to try to cram in as many spooky, scary deluxe playthroughs as we can. And we've been saving up some deluxe ones, and we'll go back to some old favorites like Deadbolt Mystery Society. But I think even before October, with the new air conditioner, quiet air conditioner, I'll be playing some more streams, and I'm going to try to schedule some daytime streams and weekends for those of you who prefer playing during the day. Anything else to talk about? Okay. Then let us recap a little bit this Dear Holmes case. This has actually been an unusual case in that it hasn't had much of the key ingredient that I associate with my favorite mystery cases, which is, in this case, there are very few contradictory, inexplicable facts. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm curious what your take on this case is. But the introductory setup was quite compelling. We've got archaeologists, semi-serious archaeologists, exploring a cave looking for treasure. There's an accident, a cave-in. One of them gets killed, the leader of the expedition. And the circumstances of the cave-in and the death are a bit suspicious. But over the course of 3 letters, what stands out to me is the lack of contradictory evidence. It's all very circumstantial and feels like there's almost none of it that seems like direct evidence that needs to be explained. Now, in the last letter, we did come across a bloody bottle. I mean, it seems clear to us that there's foul play at hand. But unlike many of these cases, we don't have like weird items that we have to sort of explain, or a weird circumstance that needs explanation. Like, how could this possibly have happened? In our case, we've got a cave-in that we suspect was helped by a person, not natural, and then we've got a guy who there's conflicting story about when he fell, how he got injured, and a bloody bottle. So we think he was hit on the head with the bottle, but there's no other piece for us to explain. There's no odd situation that we can't make sense of. There's some odd occurrences, like one of our guys, the local guide, is clearly a part of this foresty cult, but it's just a weird situation. So it doesn't feel like there's much of a job for us to do other than be suspicious, and all of our evidence feels very circumstantial. So maybe what we'll do is we'll very quickly skim through these letters. There's a bunch of them now, so I don't want to spend too much time. We're called to the case by a local priest who works at St. Eleth, and telling us that they think something is suspicious. The archaeological troupe has come. The leader, his wife, a newspaper guy, and some assistant, and a local guide. There's a cave-in. The main guy is killed. The wife runs to a local farm to report on it. Dylan Dewey is the local guide. He seems to rush in to try to rescue someone, but it's quite suspicious. He says they shouldn't be in these caves looking for treasures, but he wants to guide them anyway. Scene of the cave-in. 2 of the people seems like they needed to be rescued from the passageways, which seems to suggest that they did get caught in the cave-in, but no one knows how the cave-in happened. Some theories that it could have been easy if someone knocked over some stones. A statue of this old religion is found in the cave. Old rusty equipment outside the cave that seems to comport with the idea that these caves were used as a religious ceremony where people would throw old rusty weapons and food in there. We see that our local guide, is a member of this cult, dumping similar weapons in a similar cave, but far away. The religious people believe in water as some transportation thing. It's all very weird, but doesn't seem all that directed to our stuff. Then we get a bunch, when we talk to the other people on the expedition, they all have slightly inconsistent stories about how the main guy died. This person says, we heard a yelp as this guy was walking to us and he slipped on something near the entrance. And there is some odd talk about the body. He's got mud on him. We know he was in a watery area where there's a little local pond. We know they sent Dylan to get something to collect stuff from in the water, etc. We know that they're drinking. They all seem to be very heavy drinkers and not taking their job here very seriously, spending days all just getting drunk. When we talk to the wife, she shows us the bruises around her neck. We're told that Mortimer, the guy who died, who led the expedition, was a bad drunk and an alcoholic and abused her occasionally. When we confront her with whether she's too friendly with this newspaper guy, she suddenly kicks us out. She says, I'm not feeling well. Ask the maid to take us out. This is our last letter we're caught up on here. Then we talk to the newspaper guy who looks like he's joining this expedition sort of unofficially. And when we talk to the newspaper guy, he's at the bar getting fully drunk. He also looks like an alcoholic. The thing that jumped up to me is this idea that they're maybe all alcoholics. In fact, the wife here, there's a weird thing where we ask her what happened. She says, I can't. We say, how was it that you found out about this cave collapse while you were outside of the cave sleeping or something? She says, I can't recall. And then we say, well, was it that, it must have been that you were having lunch. And she says, yes, maybe, I can't recall. That made me think, are they all alcoholics? Anyway, the newspaper guy is clearly an alcoholic, drinking it up. We say, maybe you're too close with the wife, and he says, get out of here. And in fact, we met Mortimer's assistant woman that looks like maybe he's having an affair with her, so people having affairs. And then this is where we get shown that this guy picked up a bottle. We're told there were 6 whiskey bottles for 5 people. But this person says, no, look, this bottle has blood on it down by the river, down by the edge of the creek. And our guy did have mud on his boots, but it's not clear if the mud came from inside the cave or not. But I think what we're circling around now is this idea, at least what I'm circling around, is the idea that this guy Mortimer was hit on the back of the head and possibly killed outside the cave. Maybe they're all even drunk and don't remember exactly who killed him, but maybe he was strangling the wife, the other guy hit him on the back of the head, and then they've worked all together to hide the death inside the cave, and that Dewey, the local guide, has been bribed off. He's the one guy that probably wasn't super drunk, and he may have gotten bribed. That's why he's come into money recently. Then there's a little bit of someone overhears, this is again our last letter, overhears some stuff. Miss Heather urged me to take record of several phrases overheard by the wife and the newspaper guy at her house. She says, it seemed like the sorts of things anyone might say after an accident. Miss Heather explained, so I didn't think it was important to let you know, but I did overhear Mrs. Payne and the reporter sobbing in his arms. And she says, the dig already cost us so much, then Mort goes and blank, 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 and now this, we'll have nothing. So she thinks it sounds like it was an accident. That's why she didn't mention this earlier. But I think maybe what she's talking about is how this Mort got killed. It is sort of an accident. Sort of they killed him. Someone killed him, hit him on the back of the head. Maybe even she pushed him away and he fell down on a bottle, whatever. Died by accident, but then they've covered it up and made it look like he died in the cave. We also hear someone else say slightly different circumstances about how he died. One person says he tripped on something, slipped on something, slightly different stories. So that's where we are. Now let me check in with the chat and see if there are any different theories, different ideas. Marlene says, I've been thinking it's the wife, reason being the expedition was a setup. I don't think this was a planned murder. I do not think this was a planned murder. I think this was, they all got drunk. He attacked the wife. We're told he's a mean drunk. And he got hit on the back of the head and killed accidentally. And then they've framed this as a way to cover up that the wife killed him or that the newspaper guy killed him. Ron says, I don't think a case needs contradictory evidence, just a bunch of circumstantial evidence could be fun to try to build a plausible theory around. Important thing is not too obvious what's happened. There's room for different theories. I'm not arguing that it needs to have these contradictory facts. I'm just remarking on the fact that it's a little unusual that we've got such a circumstantial case here, and that it doesn't match the pattern that tends to be my favorite when we have facts that we cannot explain. Here, everything seems explainable in a couple different ways, and it feels like we're being asked to find the most plausible explanation. Maureen said, I'm thinking gambling, considering early mention of horses. The only gambling mention here is that Dewey has recently come into money and he's bought a horse, a racehorse out of it. But my theory is he's just been paid off. Listener says, I think it's the little inconsistencies that make this a case. It's just enough to know something happened, but not enough to be obvious. It will be the little thing that brings it all down. I'm not sure there's going to be one key piece of evidence here, though, but I do agree they're little pieces. I mean, there were a bunch of theories we had having to do with Dewey and his role in this cult, but I'm now thinking, we thought, did Dewey really have some treasures in there that he was trying to kill them off so he would get? But in our last letter, we got something that seemed to take the wind out of that theory. Someone comes up to us and says, hey, that local guy Dewey, he knew there were no treasures in that cave. It says, we were in that cave earlier, and there was nothing more to be found. We searched that Cromlech a month ago, and we just found the rusty weapons. So that seems to eliminate the possibility that there were treasures in here that Dewey was selling. That was one of our theories, that Dewey killed this guy when he stumbled onto his treasure trove, and now to get money, he sold the treasures. But this seems to suggest that's not the case. That's why I think the money he's got is he's being paid off by the others in this expedition. One of the things that the group did discuss a little bit and didn't really come to a strong feeling about, although this could be one of these things that a little lazy, but was time of death. Now, it felt like we're told a little bit about how much rigor mortis was. It felt like it could have been consistent with when he got killed. But I think if our theory is right, that he got killed ahead of time and they dragged his body into the cave to make it look like he was killed in this accident. We were thinking, would that make it more or less consistent with the rigor mortis time of death? And it seems a little ambiguous to me. So, yeah. So does anyone want to get on record with their theory of the case if it differs from mine? So my basic theory of the case is this. They're all sort of alcoholics. When Mortimer, the leader of the expedition, drinks, he gets violent with his wife. That's what happened during one of their drinking bouts. He's strangling her, and someone hits him on the back of the head with the bottle, probably the newspaper guy, and kills him. Or they wake up and he's dead. Like, they're all drunk. That's my theory. And they realize they're going to have to make it look like he died in a cave-in. And so that they all get together as a conspiracy and come up with this plan. They promise Dewey they're going to pay him off and make him look like a hero. So they all come out with their story. They cause the cave-in. Maybe one of them, like maybe even the wife, doesn't know what's happened because she passed out drunk, but I suspect they all know. And then they've all agreed that they're all going to benefit from this, that Mortimer wasn't a good guy. And they're all one's going to get his job. One is going to be free to marry the newspaper guy. The newspaper guy's going to get the girl. Dewey's going to get fame and fortune and get paid off. So that's my theory. It wasn't planned, but in their drunk stupor, he got killed, and then they've just covered it up. So does anyone want to get on the record with a different theory before we read the solution here? Anna says, I thought that he died before the cave accident. That's why his body wasn't rigid when it was examined. That was one of our working theories, that the timeline was more consistent with him dying before the cave-in, which is what my theory is. I just feel like the rigor mortis is in the range that it would make sense either way, unfortunately. Rob says, mostly agree with Jesse. They are all aware of what happened. I don't think they're all alcoholics, just Payne was. Okay, interesting. Marlene says, how do we explain the fact that these two other people were trapped in the cave-in? So Marlene doesn't agree with it. It was actually one of the more interesting discussions we had, which is, if they faked this cave-in, how is it that two of them seem to have been trapped in the cave-in and had to be dug out? It's a really good question. And I guess my best explanation was that they found a place where they would be safe and to make it look real. But we did discuss for a while, who would volunteer to be potentially caught in a cave-in? And doesn't that argue against the idea that it was a setup, that it was staged? Rob still thinks it was staged. Marlene says, because of this unbelievability of them volunteering to be caught in a cave-in, Marlene says the murder was a setup. Someone Dewey knew nothing was in the cave. I'm not sure what that means. Melissa says, pretty much agree. I think the cave-in happened. They took advantage of that to stage things. So, Melissa, you think that the cave-in was a genuine accident? I don't see that. But I could imagine that the two people that seemed to be caught in the cave-in weren't really. That maybe they planted the body, they came out, they triggered the cave-in, and then two other people went and waited in there to make it look like they were trapped. My theory is that the cave-in was staged, created, after the body was planted in there. All right. Let me get the latest letter, assuming that everyone's on the record that wants to be on the record. And it says, Jesse's theory seems plausible. Maybe Rob's right. They were all drinking, but only Payne was an alcoholic and abusive. That's certainly possible. Them all being alcoholics is not central to my theory. The only thing that really strikes me as odd, first of all, it seemed like an odd coincidence that the newspaper guy is at the bar, clearly drunk. But the thing that really stood out to me as odd, let's talk about this, because I found this a very intriguing section. Now imagine you've created this fake story to explain. Imagine it was premeditated, or you were all in your right mind. You kill this guy, the husband, and you plant him in the cave, and you've come up with the story to explain how he was killed in the cave-in. Now look what happens when he talks to the wife. She admits he's an alcoholic. She shows the bruises around her throat, right? She says, this is Mortimer's work. He's an alcoholic. And now look what happened. We say, I understand you were in the camp when the men were working in the cromlech. And we say, how was it that you learned of the cave-in? She's crying and she says, I can't recall. Now, that's not what you do when you've come up with a carefully planned story to explain something. This is something she should be able to recall, right? Her answer should be very pat. Yes, I was cooking the chicken and I heard a crash and I ran over and I saw the cave had collapsed. That's how you come up with a story. Here we say, hey, what happened? And she says, I can't recall. And then we press her a little bit, right? We press her a little bit. And what does she say? We give her a possibility. We say, well, it was probably that you were cooking lunch. And she says, maybe, I can't recall. And she goes silent. And then she says, well, I feel so. I feel it was so. And then she says, the maid comes back with teapot. She's thinking about the wonderful time when she met the newspaper guy. And then she says, Becky, I'm feeling poorly. Show this gentleman out. I really do feel unwell. So it's possible she's just trying to get rid of us. I think that's the surface level reading, that we're asking about her having this affair. And she said she's coming up with this excuse. But the fact that she doesn't have an answer for what happened, how did she realize there was a cave-in, makes me very suspicious that she really doesn't remember, because she was sort of blackout drunk. And I'm sort of thinking, like, did she black out when she was being choked and they were all drinking? And does she not even know what happened? Are we dealing with a situation where, like, she killed him with the bottle, but she's blackout drunk, passed out, And now they're coming up with this scheme to pretend that the body was killed in the cave-in, and she doesn't actually know how he died. Like, she's woken up from a blackout and realized the husband's dead, and she doesn't actually know what happened. Rob says, no, she's just in shock. You can't expect her to have recall. Arlene says, drugged. No, I don't think she's drugged. Maybe she lost consciousness when the husband was choking her and wasn't part of the murder. Yeah, that's sort of where I'm going here. Like, I'm starting to think that she doesn't really know about the setup. That she's woken up from her drunken blackout, and she's not in on it. Mom says, I'm still hoping for my mummy theory to play out. There's this whole little side thread about the daughter of the delivery guy being precocious and wanting to touch the body and knowing about mummies being preserved. It's not clear that has anything to do with our story. All right, well, everyone's on the record who needs to get on the record. We're going to read the solution now from Holmes. Here we go. 4 November 1902, 221B Baker Street. Dear Reverend Skinner, I have appreciated your detailed account of what I've come to call the problem of the Celtic curse. Your extraordinary ability to note and recount conversations with individuals makes it possible for me to know, with some certainty, that 2 serious crimes have been committed in your village: murder and attempted murder. Your initial plea for help, dated October the 29th, set before me an accidental death that, as you wrote, seemed odd, due to a melding of suggestive circumstances and portentous facts. In this case, the facts, though portentous, were quite simple. 4 men enter a cave and only 3 emerge. One of them might be a murderer, and if so, then the others would likely be witnesses. Yet we had neither witnesses nor any semblance of who among the explorers might be a murderer. To begin with, I will admit that your letters swayed me in the direction of your and Mr. Nichols' concerns. That is to say, I suspected there was something more to the circumstances of Mr. Payne's death, be it accidental or otherwise, than what we had learned from his associates. The condition of his corpse was not necessarily unusual, considering he was deceased. However, it seems misaligned with the events that our witnesses claimed had occurred. No doubt the massive wound on his head could have resulted of the cavern collapsing onto him, but his body was not found covered in stones or anything the like. What's more, when a person falls, they tend to land on their side or the front of their body, because their momentum carries them forward. They also tend to instinctively use their hands or arms to break their fall, leading to additional injuries on those limbs. Perhaps he had fallen from a great height or somehow been thrown backwards to the ground, I thought at the time, but even this seems rather unlikely, given that the cromlech consisted of narrow tunnels and a large central chamber. Remember, his wound is in the back of the head. We remarked on that as already. There was also the question of Mrs. Payne and her reaction. Specifically, I wondered, why had Mrs. Payne demanded to return to the camp with Rory Campbell in the aftermath of the incident? Had Campbell and the others failed to locate or retrieve Mr. Payne's body, this reaction would have been quite understandable, but this was instead her response to the fact his body had been extracted from the cavern. She might have thought it had been taken to their campsite, but even so, the fact she insisted they return to the camp rather than to her husband's body was of note. This is not ringing a bell. I do not remember her insisting they go back to the camp after they found the body. That sounds like something we completely overlooked. Considering these details, I was, as I have already stated, inclined to agree with Mr. Nichols' assessment of the circumstances and eager to start thoroughly investigating. With regard to suspicious people, your first letter brought forth a number of those who would have had the opportunity to act against Mr. Payne, namely the survivors of the expedition, the Heathers, who owned the land, and Ellis Nichols, who knew where they were. Nichols had personally led us to this investigation and displayed no obvious motives. Greed was a possibility, but in that case, he would have been the last to draw attention to the death. Unless he had been driven by an intensely personal secret motive, then it was implausible for him to be our culprit. Thus he was dismissed from the start. The Heathers I could not dismiss without additional information, for though a motivating force was yet unclear, they surely knew the explorer's whereabouts and had ample opportunity and means by which to commit the theoretical crime. Last but not least were the survivors, who had arguably more opportunity than the Heathers would have had, although a precise motive was difficult to discern. My preliminary theories were not few, but my strongest general inclination was thus. Mr. Payne had met his demise at the hands of somebody who sought to profit from the cromlech he was exploring. I still could not say whether the profit was money itself or an intangible treasure, fame, and an accidental death was not entirely implausible. Nevertheless, there were far too many curious facts to declare his death a product of pure chance. When your second letter arrived, it took but 2 paragraphs of your missive to convince me that Mortimer Payne had indeed been murdered. Plainly speaking, the clue that veritably proclaims murder was his corpse. It may be true that dead men tell no tales. However, Dr. Watson and I have dealt with enough corpses to know that the body of a man speaks volumes. For instance, the time of death can be determined by several factors, including rigor, or the stiffness of the body and limbs. Less than 24 hours after Payne's body was discovered, you described his limbs as being pliable, making it easy for you to remove his clothing. Even little Rosie herself revealed this when she poked her finger into the soft flesh of the corpse's cheek. This, combined with the reddish tint you described, indicates that death occurred much more than a day earlier. I estimate closer to 36 hours, which would have been prior to the cave-in. Also, we must not overlook the fact that in your examination of the corpse you found no wounds or lacerations beside the massive one on the back of the skull. Not a cut or a scrape or bruise anywhere on the hands or arms, further supporting the theory that this death was not the result of a fall. I will also note that the state of Mr. Payne's clothes, which you observed to be caked in mud, piqued my curiosity, but I think it best we return to this just after a trifle of further analysis, for this same letter also cast doubt upon Dylan Dewey, Fiona Payne, and Rory Campbell. As you and others in your community took note of, Dewey's recent purchase of a horse was extravagant, to say the least. Despite the fact Dewey was known as a regular goer at the racecourse, the timing of what was his very first equestrian acquisition was worthy of scrutiny. Had he suddenly come across a large sum of cash, and if so, how? If he had received such a sum as payment for the Payne expedition, he would have surely mentioned it when interviewed. So just a note that those of you who said that the rigor mortis was a clear clue that he had been murdered much earlier, our Holmes agrees with you. I also took that as consistent that he was killed earlier, and indeed that was my theory that he was killed earlier, but I felt the rigor mortis was not as clear cut. But perhaps this is a good lesson for us that we should have spent more time really working out whether that rigor mortis was clearly inconsistent, because I took it as much more ambiguous. Okay. If it was payment, he would have admitted it. He would have come out with it, rather than simply stating there had been no treasure in the cromlech. In addition to this, Mr. Nichols' statement regarding Mrs. Payne and Mr. Campbell emerging from their tents together, frenzied, led me to question their acquaintanceship. Just how friendly were they, I wondered, and more importantly, were there any connections between them, Dewey, and Mr. Payne's demise that we had not yet unearthed? After all, a dalliance between Mrs. Payne and Mr. Campbell could have motivated one or both of them to act against Mortimer. Likewise, he might have been spurred to act against them if he suspected deceit. Still, there was the matter of Colin Biddle and his unexpected promotion, bearing in mind that this new position at the British Museum was a direct consequence of Mr. Payne's death. It seemed he stood the most to gain from it. Were these other details irrelevant, or was there an even more elaborate conspiracy underway? The answers to my quandaries were not in plain sight. However, the contents of your November 1st letter did lead me to the cusp of this mystery's solution. My theory began to take shape as I read Mr. Biddle's response to your inquiry. How did Payne meet his death? According to Mr. Biddle, Payne was fatally injured after slipping in the cavern, whilst the others were investigating the pool found in the Cromwell's grotto. This was later corroborated by the interview with Mr. Campbell, detailed in your most recent letter dated November the 4th. Reviewing Mr. Biddle's account, I was reminded of the very first reports of the cavern's collapse and of the survivors' reactions. Specifically, I noticed an alarming discrepancy between their reactions on the day of the collapse and their respective accounts in the aftermath. When asked of Mr. Payne's death, Biddle and Campbell claimed that he fell to his demise as they probed the cavern. Still, when rescued from the cavern's collapse, they told Nichols and the other rescuers that they feared Mr. Payne was still trapped inside. Here I finally started seeing through the deception underway. I hypothesized that Campbell and the other adventurers were truthfully startled by the cavern's collapse. However, they were nonetheless obscuring the truth about Mortimer Payne, who most certainly was deceased prior to the cave-in. Given the similarity between Biddle and Campbell's reactions, as well as Mrs. Payne's own interest in returning to the camp after the collapse, I suspected there were several people aware of the true circumstances of his death. Thus, I was left with two questions. On the one hand, the question of who. That is, who was personally responsible for the death, and was it one or more individuals? On the other hand, the question of the collapse. I did believe it caught the adventurers by surprise, yet I hesitated to accept it was a natural occurrence. Thankfully, I did not have to ponder this for long, as your latest letter brought light to these questions and all others that persisted. Ellis and Mrs. Heather's discovery at the campsite, together with the information gathered from your meetings with Mrs. Payne and Rory Campbell, helped answer the who question, whereas the truth to the cavern collapse was made plain by Mrs. Heather's other revelation and your subsequent encounter with Dylan Dewey. I will explain forthwith. From Mrs. Payne, you learned much of the deceased and of the history of their relationship. As she stated, they met while she held the post currently held by Pamela Wingate. She also noted that she insisted she join her husband on his adventures, regardless of the fact that she did not fully approve of the circus atmosphere and the carousing that was so often a part of these excursions. Coupled with the knowledge that Mr. Payne was an alco, and Miss Wingate was so bereft after his death, I am inclined to believe Mrs. Payne suspected infidelity during her husband's trips. Furthermore, this suspicion did not wane over time. Instead, it motivated Mrs. Payne to seek affection from elsewhere, from Rory Campbell. Their closeness was apparent from the start and supported by Mrs. Payne's abrupt withdrawal from your interview once questioned about him. Now, I urge you to consider your recent conversation with Campbell. during which he raised his hand to his neck when describing his remaining bruises. For my part, this detail immediately reminded me of the bruises on Miss Payne's neck, which she attributed to her husband. Therefore, I was able to piece together what occurred to Mortimer Payne. On the day of the cavern collapse, the tension between Mr. Payne and his wife, her lover Mr. Campbell, and Biddle, who was no particular fan of Payne, came to a whiskey-fueled boil. Payne, while at the camp with the others, attacked Campbell in a drunken, jealous rage. Taking him by his neck, as he had previously done to his wife, Mrs. Payne, Mrs. Payne, having experienced similar attacks, impulsively struck her husband with the first object she had at hand, a whiskey bottle, and there he fell. I posit that the group offered Dillon Dewey a generous sum to say nothing of the ordeal, and then determined to place Payne's body in the cavern and blame the fatal wound on an accident. And in the process of transporting the body, I will add, they managed to sully it with mud to an extent that would have been unlikely to occur had Payne simply been exploring the cavern. This, as I suggested before, drew my eye to their plot in the earlier parts of our investigation. What the group failed to predict, unfortunately, was Dewey's devotion to his God-bound duty. With regard to my second question, that of the cavern collapse, I am inclined to say that it was Mr. Dewey's own attempt at punishing the group for their sacrilegious actions. What began as a debaucherous exploration of the cave eventually turned into a foul crime. And further still, Campbell, Mrs. Payne, and Biddle were all hoping to veil their involvement by means of the cromlech. This, I surmise, Mr. Dewey refused to allow, so he took advantage of their panicked return to the cavern and caused a collapse that would seem both like an accident and an act of divine retribution. Young Rosie herself said there were many good places to hide among the ruins surrounding the cromlech, so it is most likely that Dewey remained hidden nearby while the rescue ensued, until scurrying back to the entrance to play hero. Mrs. Payne was, as Mrs. Heather noted, truly devastated by news of the collapse, and for good reason. The rest of her group, including her lover, were now possibly dead and trapped in the cavern with her husband's corpse. And we should not forget that once she knew Campbell had survived, her objective was to return to the camp rather than her husband's body. I now realize this is because the collapse had interrupted her own part of the obfuscation, removing evidence, like the whiskey bottle, from the true site of Payne's death. After the survivors were recovered from the cavern, along with Payne's body, the group undoubtedly suspected their guide, but were bound to silence by their crimes. I believe this explains the general animosity towards Dewey during our investigation, not to mention Mr. Campbell's reference to the man as Lord Mammon, known for his greed. That is interesting. I was made more certain of my theory and of Dillon Dewey's role after reviewing Ellis's initial observations of the surviving adventurers. As he stated, the light from the rescue party's lanterns hurt the eyes of Colin Biddle and Rory Campbell, who had to be guided out from the cave. This would make sense because when we were in darkness for an extended period, our pupils dilate wider to let in more light. And if a light suddenly appears, it creates a sensation of pain until our eyes can adjust. What does not seem right, on the contrary, was Dewey's response upon being found at the entrance of the cromlech. Indeed, his vision was unimpaired by the light outside, and he required a lantern before charging inside with the others to retrieve Payne's body. This suggests that he was never in the tomb when the collapse occurred. What next, you ask? We must see to it that all those involved are brought before the law. I have already sent word to an acquaintance, a young lieutenant from North Wales Police Headquarters, who is en route to Almwich as of this morning. While he ensures that Dylan Dewey is brought into custody of the police, his colleague will seek out Biddle, Mrs. Payne, and Campbell. Although there may be a need for further questioning, I doubt their lies will persist for much longer. If any of the people involved change their story, then, like the stones in that ancient cromlech, their entire charade will tumble. Especially in light of the collapse survivors' disdain for Dewey. Should the need arise, do not hesitate to write me again in the future. Reverend, I would be most happy to lend my mind to another singular puzzle. Sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective. So there you have it. Mostly our theory is correct. The part we got wrong was that the plan was not to collapse the cave to hide the murder. The plan was simply to put the body in the cave to make it look like he died while exploring. But then Dylan Dewey, the local occult guide, took the opportunity to try to kill them all by causing a cave-in. That seems rather implausible to me. So I'm not... The only thing that's... it does confirm that the group's doubt that two people would volunteer to be caught in a cave-in, which Marlene was the one to remind us about and find most implausible. Marlene was right that no one volunteered to be caught in that cave-in, but the cave-in was a complete surprise to them. There were a couple of things mentioned that we didn't remember picking up on that Holmes seemed to think was so significant. For example, the wife wanting to get back to the camp. We sort of completely missed that. I do think it seems unlikely, though, that implausible, the story that Dylan tried to kill 4 people that he had led twice on expeditions just seems wrong to me. That just seems that that's a very weird thing. To say that he tried to kill 4 people on a whim, on a last-minute whim. So I don't love that. And the evidence for it seems very thin. Holmes seems to have put that together with some very flimsy evidence. I do like the part that that he's mentioning how Rory called Dylan Dewey the devil. Like, a little bit more of that would have been nice. And it is interesting that the piece of evidence that I found most interesting was not touched on by Holmes, and that's the wife not remembering what happened. That was the piece of evidence that I was most intrigued by. Rob says, I still think this is one of the better cases, mostly coherent and an okay solution. Sleeping Dragon says, I want to know how Dewey pulled off a cave-in that had no evidence of a person doing it. Well, that we have an answer to. We're told in one of the letters how easy it would be to cause a cave-in in these particular caves. It's because this is sort of a man-made cave, and there are rocks that prop it up, and they get stolen away over time, and so it really would take very little effort to cause a cave-in. It is interesting that Rob says this is one of the better cases, because I would call this close to my least favorite case. So actually, Anna says, I'm going to rewatch the letters. Curious if we should have picked up that it was the wife while she was rescuing her lover from the husband. That's a good question. I don't think you are going to pick up on that. I think it makes our theory was that Rory hit the guy he while Mortimer was choking his wife, and Holmes has figured out that the wife hit Mortimer while Mortimer was choking out Rory. But I'm not sure how you could be sure of one or the other. But if you do see evidence of it, let me know. Okay, let's talk about this. Let's see if we can't rank this. I'm curious where you guys would ranking. So here is my ranking of the cases. And we can see my favorite case was the fickle fiancés. A lot of cases I rate at 7. I'm going to rate this one a 6. This is my least favorite case. It is interesting that Rob marks this at the top. For me, there just wasn't enough interesting clues. I liked the setup a lot, but the clues just weren't there. And the clues that were most interesting to me were insignificant. I love that she didn't remember, and I thought that was going to be significant. I thought that the fact that they were all alcoholics was interesting. I liked the little role of this girl and her talk about mummies that seemed relevant, that weren't. The rigor mortis seemed a little ambiguous. The role of the cult planting rusty weapons down the hole, and then we found rusty weapons that looked like they had been dragged out of this cave, again, was not relevant. So for me, there wasn't enough interesting clues, and those clues that I found most interesting were irrelevant, and I really didn't feel like big aspects of this conclusion were justified, like who was the actual person. And then the whole implausibility of the cave-in being caused by Dewey seemed unlikely to me. So how would you guys rate these? Where would you put this case? Rob says he would put the Celtic curse near the top. Anyone else anyone else who've played the majority of these cases would rank it above or below them? Best line. Why didn't they just take the train? I don't remember that. Anna says the part where the wife says she couldn't remember seems very strange after this solution. I agree with you. I agree with you. Melissa says yes, this was better than the blacksmith one. I guess I'm more tolerant of the crazy cartoonishness in some of these cases. This one didn't have too much crazy cartoonishness, but because of that, it was a little bit less interesting. DJ Moneycat says the Dewey cave-in theory was one of many proposed in the Discord, but there really wasn't any proof that we could grab onto. That's right. I agree with that. Rob says, actually, the part about her not being able to remember makes more sense. She was actually in real shock. Isara says, I thought the story was nice, the mystery a little cloudy. if anyone has played the majority of this case, so this is a Google spreadsheet shared document. Let me know on the Discord or on the Board Game Geek Guild, and I can give you access so you can add your ratings if we're keeping track. DJ Monica says, I felt like it felt more real than the more fantastical cases. I put it above the bird case or the crates. So you guys like the more realistic cases. Interesting. Anna says, my least favorite was the one with the killing of dogs. Well, not actually killing any dogs, just beating. That one was insane. That is the one that is the Bewildered Blacksmith, which I rated as a 7. Although now that I think about it, I think maybe I would change this 7 to a 7.5 or an 8. I actually like that one quite a bit. I like the ones that can't be explained. I like the ones that are so bewildering. Or was that the Chalfont Outrageous? Was the dog the Chalfont Outrageous or Bewildered Blacksmith? Now I can't remember. Isara says, my favorite was the Yuletide Cipher. The blacksmith is where they were kidnapping the kids. Okay, yes. So that stays a 7. So I already rated the dog one as an 8. That was the first one we played. All right. Well, let me know your voting, your rankings in the Discord, and I'll add them. I still enjoy the system, and it's fun to play these with you guys over the course of 5 weeks. We'll have to talk about, we could start a new case this coming Sunday, or we could take a break for a week and play Mug Book or something else and then come back. So I said I was going to show you some of these books. So let me show you some of these books. So here are 2 brand new books that I just got. They're both interactive mystery novels, basically. And Janice Howlett has written a previous one called The Appeal, which I'm not sure why I don't have. This one, I believe, just got released. This one very recently. You can see they're quite big. Let's take a look at them. So they all have the same flavor. They look like they're inspired by the crime dossiers, but they're much more like a novel. So let's see how it's structured here. Case file 1, people's recounts. Case file 2, case file 3. So you can see if we look at the first one, this one looks like it's very much framed as a detective mystery. Everyone's a suspect. You're the detective. You've been summoned to the sophomore manor. An interactive mystery novel. So it's not paragraph based. You don't jump around. You just read through it. You read people's recounts, like statements. It looks like it's just people's statements. Okay, then there's some police questioning here, newspaper clipping, diary entries. Again, you don't, and then a little recap of the items. Looks like there's also some little hints here too. Okay, so a book with a real solution and lots of reading. We could do this. We could pick one of these books to read through and read through a section each week if we wanted to. Now this one just came out. I may have The Appeal, but but haven't brought it out. I'm not sure why that would be. But this one is brand new. I just had this pre-order and it just came, or just arrived. 6 students, 1 murder. Can you solve the crime? This one says it's a novel, but I don't think it's all that different than that one we just looked at, because if you look at it, this is the Examiner. Dear reader, I need to oversee the final grades for a master's degree at a prestigious university. Despite access to all the documents, I find myself unable to grade the submissions. I'd appreciate your help. Please read the enclosed. Let me know. For context, it includes an academic year calendar marked with key dates, the official guidelines that govern our marking process, and my correspondence. One of the students on this course is dead. So look, here's our calendar, a timeline. And then this book, this story, looks like it's made up mostly of modern correspondence. So she's talking about the Doodle message board. This is an email. This is, you can see text messages, Doodle message group, so emails. This one looks like it's much more in the form of modern group text messages and emails. No table of contents. You simply read through. Let me see. Yeah, just collection, I think in sequential, I think in over a year-long period, exchanges. Okay, so these are the 2 most recent one, and I think the appeal is the same structure. I don't know why I don't have it in front of me if I do have it. And then going backwards a little bit is Strongwood, billed as a crime dossier. Now, I don't have any of the original dossiers that were the Dennis Wheatley 1930s. I've shown those on a stream in the past. These are the more modern ones. And I don't have any of the Sherlock Holmes crime dossiers. These are sort of a spin-off, you would say. These are much more in book form. No facsimile evidence, no photographs of evidence, but more structured as a novel or a sequence of letters. But Strongwood looks very similar to the ones we've just looked at. This one is told in correspondence, but also trial testimonies, journal entry, excerpts from direct testimony. I think maybe the appeal had this flavor as well, excerpts from testimony. So transcriptions from testimony. What does it say here? His 7th Sherlock Holmes mystery. Shot dead, murder, someone goes on trial. As the case unfolds, the jury must decide. So this one looks like you're looking in on a trial and you have to just figure out what happened. Then we get to older ones here. So this looks similar to the one we just looked at in terms of being told in the form of trials. Now, you might recognize this author, Will Orsler. Does anyone remember where we encountered Will Orsler before? This is, again, trial transcripts, cross-examination transcripts. Look, this one's got some trial evidence submitted to trial. So this is told in the form of little snippets during a trial. I think this one is, This one may not be told in the form of trial transcript. Office files. I guess this one's not told in the form of trial transcript, but more like a classical dossier. Okay, well, since no one has jumped in, Will Orsler did Memo to the Commissioner, which was one of the 1950s classic crime dossiers that we played on this channel. Then we have this one, which is much closer in spirit to the Dennis Wheatley. Well, I'm not sure that's true. This one says with candid camera clues. Okay, so this one is much more filled with photographs. This is the Castle Island case. Castle Island case. Published under Hitchcock. And I understand this one has got clues in all the photographs you could see. This is much more of like a classic case file in which you might be studying these photographs to look for clues. We might play that one day. And what do we have here? Folio and Florence White. Actually, this is just a copy of this one. Not sure why it's so different in size, or why I have two of these. I think it's the same. And then we have this more recent one, F, which is a very odd book and is filled with real documents and annotated. It's told in the form of someone going through this book. I mean, this is a dense thing here. I don't know why this doesn't get more attention. It may be that it's not a proper mystery, but much more of just an experience. Does anyone know more about this? I mean, it looks pretty impressive. I'm not sure why this isn't all more of a rage. I mean, it looks really elaborate, all of the annotations here. But maybe it's not a proper mystery. One needs to fill me in on this. And then the last thing I wanted to show you, which is not like these others, but is new to me, so I did want to demonstrate it. I learned about this through the Puzzle People group on Facebook. This guy, Brent, was posting that he had just played through it. Alfred Hitchcock's Solve Them Yourself Mysteries, 5 exciting cases to test the wits of young detectives, with solutions by the master of suspense at the end of each story. I think this is the only one of these that was produced, even though it sounds like they had plans to make multiple series. But you can see 5 cases, 30 to 50 pages each. Welcome to Alfred Hitchcock's Bureau of Investigation. We're now offering a special feature to the public, a book full of new exciting stories of suspense and mystery on the self-service solve-it-yourself plan, for those who like to test their detective ability against some good meaty clues. On the other hand, for those of you who like to race after the evildoer with a tally-ho and a there he goes, we will handle all arrangements. You can enjoy the excitement of the chase and leave the clues to us. We'll gather them up after you and arrange them all neatly in place. So, Mystery of the Five Sinister Thefts. So, it's just a story with some illustrations, but then at the end, you're asked to solve it with little extra suggestions by Hitchcock. Pardon me for peeking over your shoulder, but I see something. All right, so 5 cases with solutions at the end of them. So a bunch of potential books for us to work our way through if you're interested in playing some of these. Some of my favorite sessions on this channel were when we played through Dennis Wheatley's 1930s dossiers. I'm not sure everything's going to match the feeling of going through those pioneering books, but some of these look quite interesting. Now, one difference between these and those are the sheer density of reading. This really does feel like reading a novel, so I don't know how well this would translate to actually playing on stream. But what we could do is, well, Jonathan Warner has a reading book club. You could imagine this might be a good scenario for reading and discussing online in a weekly book reading club, especially all of the ones here that could be purchased currently and that are in print. This set here, these you'd have to pick up on eBay, but we could certainly read through one of these and discuss it weekly. Or you could just consider this video a little heads up about what's out there. All right, any final thoughts from the channel? Any projects you guys are working on? We'll probably have a session this week, maybe on Wednesday, play through one of these cases behind me. I'm sort of curious to try out that Crypto Killer box that I know nothing about. I'm also curious about going through the new Time Stories boxes. I think maybe we'll try to play Cavendish in October during our spooky Halloween stuff, since that looks like a creepy mansion with some time travel stuff. I wouldn't mind playing A Wealth of Murder. We'll be playing a bunch more Deadbolt Mystery Society surely in October. We still have to schedule a playthrough of the new Razorhurst Blood Alley. We're sort of struggling to find a good time for that. And there is a Bureau of Investigation fan case for us to play. We'll probably play that in October. Another Masters of Crime box to go through. Lots of stuff to do. Okay. If you have any old Dear Holmes letters, please get in touch with me. I'm looking to pick up letters older than a year ago, older than 2023 or so, that I haven't played through on the channel, so that we have a constant supply of them. We'll talk before next week about whether we're going to start a new series or not. Given that no one else has anything else to say, we're going to sign off here. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for a fun month playing through the Celtic Curse. I'll see you next time.